Hello class, today Andrew and I will be discussing to you about Black history in Canada and Canada's involvement in the slave trade industry. Africans deserve reparations for the times they have been wronged by European countries. It has always been a controversial issue whether or not Canada should also be held liable for the slave trade and service industry. However, historical events and actions taken by the Canadian government have proved that Canada is not guilty of slavery. From the 15th to the 19th century, millions of Africans were taken, against their will, removed from their homeland and brought to Canada and other countries. While Europeans and others throughout the world were building generations of economic wealth and power, Africans were being sold to slavery. Before the Charter of Rights and Freedoms were introduced, multiple types of actions occurred that caused Canada to seem guilty of inequality towards people of color. The initial example of limited inequality in Canada occurred in 1734, when an enslaved black woman named Marie Joseph Angelique was accused of igniting the house of her owner and burning it down. Another example that limited equality involved a racial wage gap. In 1784, white soldiers complained when they found themselves competing for jobs with black neighbors who were paid less for the same work. King Louis XIV formally authorized slavery in New France. Once the British claimed New France in 1760, it was stated that blacks would continue to be slaves. Throughout Canadian history, there are many sources of the country being discriminatory. A situation that occurred in 1790 was the Imperial Statute, which allowed effective transfer of slaves to Upper Canada. The only requirements needed for these slaves were to be clothed and fed. Also, in 1792, a major event that occurred was the Black Loyalist Exodus, which, due to the immense discrimination, caused 1,200 black people to flee to Sierra Leone. Another event that occurred in 1794 was the Petition of Free Negroes, which aimed to support black people by allowing them to create a community in which they could trust each other. The petition was rejected for unknown reasons by the government of Upper Canada. Finally, a group of Jamaican Maroons were forced to leave after poor living conditions and prejudice. One more situation that occurred, even after abolishing slavery, in 1911, black people encountered another wave of prejudice and discrimination, causing Winnipeg to predict that the government would remove all black people. Keeping in mind that these events occurred before Canada's independence, granted in the Statute of Westminster.
To begin, due to the reputation that Canada gained for being a safe place, the increasing use of the Underground Railroad began from 1815 to 1860. The long-awaited day finally came on August 28, 1833, when slavery was abolished. To continue, on February 26, 1851, the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada was formed due to the number of sympathizers that grew. The initial provincial leader against discrimination is Ontario, which is apparent as they are the first province to pass the Racial Discrimination Act in 1944. This act is a landmark legislation prohibiting the publication and display of any symbol, sign, or notice that expressed ethnic, racial, or religious discrimination. 3 years later, the Saskatchewan Bill of Rights Act was passed, allowing it to be the first real law against discrimination. Then, Ontario, in 1954, passed the Fair Accommodation Practices Act, which declared no one can deny to any person or class or persons the accommodation, services, or facilities usually available to members of the public, which also included not posting any discriminatory signs. One final way Halifax showed their sincere apology was by apologizing for destroying Africville on February 24, 2010.
Human rights are rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of nationality, place of residence, sex, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, language, or any other status. We are all equally entitled to our human rights without discrimination. Aside from the three main entitlements of food, water, and shelter, these slaves were denied the rest of their rights. They were discriminated against, they were subject to slavery and forced labor, they had poor living conditions and poor working conditions. Canada is a plaintiff in this case. The actions pursued by Canada were not solely by the Canadian government. Instead, they acted with respect to the actions of Britain. Being the subordinate to Britain, and not yet being a fully independent nation until 1931, Canada was obliged to follow in Britain's footsteps. This meaning, Canada will follow and support whatever action Britain makes, even if it means denying the human rights and discriminating a race. The British government had enough power to ultimately override authority through legislation. Canada began to assert its independence in foreign policy in the early 1920s, when the government refused to commit to assisting British occupation forces. Although not a criminal case, we can still say that Canada is not guilty of the Africans' lost in slavery. Even though Canada demonstrated the guilty action, the guilty mind was not present, since Canada was encouraged by Britain. This being said, Britain should be the defendant and not Canada. One way Britain can make amends to the slaves is by possibly rebuilding Africville, to allow the family of the discriminated to have a source of heritage. Other types of reparations can come in the form of government-funded activities, which also promote the history of black slavery. Financial support, apologies, compensation of lost opportunities, restoration of liberty, and having legislation that promotes human rights standards are all effective forms of reparations. To conclude, Canada cannot be held liable, since their government's actions were merely a mirror of who they were subordinate to: Britain. After Canada gained full independence as a nation, they have truly started taking actions of their own, separate from Britain. Ever since the Statute of Westminster was passed, Ontario passed the Racial Discrimination Act in 1944. Canada supported the creation of Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. They also passed the Fair Accommodation Practices Act in 1954, in which the Act states that no one can deny to any person or class of persons the accommodation, services, or facilities usually available to members of the public. The Act also prevented anyone from posting discriminatory signs. The 1960s Bill of Rights proceeded into the Constitutional Act of 1982, entrenching the Charter of Rights and Freedoms Canadians are entitled to. As an independent nation, Canada's government will only grow from this point, being free from Britain's evidently abusive power demonstrated in the historical slave industry, and hopefully will inspire other countries to take action in making the world a better place for everyone.